In Marx's historical materialism, socialism grows out of capitalism. Socialism is not invented by anyone, but it's the inevitable result of the development of capitalism.
Marx's historical materialism is not a prophecy of an inevitable march towards communism, and the Stalinist and Dengist argument that communism will emerge out of the development of the economy or productive forces serves an insidious political function of relegating the status of class struggle and defending social democracy. Communists have to reject this teleological reading of Marx, not only because it reduces Marx and fundamentally de-radicalizes his critique, but it will also lead the proletariat to defeat. If communism was an inevitable result of history, what then is the status of class struggle? When Marx said the emancipation of the working class must be the work of the working class itself, how could he also have meant that it was the inevitable operation of economic development? If everything is leading to a predetermined outcome, then there would be no need for the proletariat to do anything. The conditions of its existence would ultimately be determined by productive or economic forces. And this is obviously nonsense. Historical materialism is an analytical framework that exposes the contradictions and conflicts within society. But far from suggesting that the development of productive forces determine an unavoidable outcome, Marx argued repeatedly that the real engine of history is class struggle, a dynamic, contingent process. Economic development happens in any mode of production, but it is the clashes between social classes that will determine any historical outcome. And even a cursory look at the most obvious texts will show Marx's argument. In the opening lines of the Communist Manifesto, it reads, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." It does not say it is the history of economic development. When Marx said, "For nearly 40 years we have raised to prominence the idea of the class struggle as the immediate driving force of history," there can be no confusion about what his meaning is. History is contingent. Historical change is driven not by some predetermined metaphysical economic forces, but by the fierce, often messy battles between antagonistic classes, abolishing and transforming the forms of activity to produce material life. In his various texts, letters and addresses, Marx repeatedly stressed that revolutionary change cannot be taken for granted. His correspondence and essays are full of calls to arms, warnings against complacency and emphasis on the working class actively waging struggle against the conditions of its existence and taking up specific forms of activity as the transformation of capitalism into communism. This is because Marx understood that transformation of society is not guaranteed, but is contingent on the proletariat mobilizing itself against the conditions of class itself, with all the uncertainty and constant contestation that comes with it. Marx's analysis fundamentally rejects any notion of teleology. A thorough reading of Marx's writings shows how he rejected the mysticism of economic determinism by centering class struggle as the decisive force in history. His analysis shows that the development of society is a battleground of class conflict, and if communism is to emerge, it will not be as an unavoidable endpoint dictated by metaphysical economic laws, but a possibility that must be actively fought for amid the unpredictability of class conflict.
Communist theorists have been abundantly clear on this topic. Communism is inevitable.
Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto, "What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable." It's a poetic and concise logline describing Marx's theory of historical materialism. But does this mean that Marx thought communism was inevitable? Despite what this American thinks, communism isn't describing an ideology. It's not even really describing an economy. It's describing a social relationship, and one that's existed in the world since hunter-gatherer societies. As technologies advanced throughout history, this social relationship became increasingly superseded. Marx argued that if we wanted to be truly free, this social relationship needed to return. When Marx was a young man, he studied the work of German philosopher Georg Hegel, who had developed a dialectical understanding of social change based on the internal conflict of human ideas. Marx realised that Hegel's dialectic should be inverted or turned upside down, and that through this dialectical process it was in fact not internal conflicts of ideas, but the material conflicts between humans producing the world around them that drove social change. Marx suggested that different societies throughout history are defined by the way they produce the things they need to exist, what we will call modes of production, and that through crisis and technological and cultural advancement, they produce the conditions for their own demise, resulting in the passing from one mode of production to a new one. Marx pointed out that in every mode of production, there always been a group of people who would benefit from a change in the mode of production and would therefore come into conflict with those people who were currently benefiting. Marx argued that this was an immanent or internal inherent contradiction in all modes of production, and that ultimately these contradictions led to varying degrees and intensity of crisis. This in turn meant that those seeking to benefit from a change in the mode of production would eventually become the revolutionary driving force, leading to the collapse of the current mode of production and the creation of a new one. He further pointed out that in the capitalist mode of production, that group of people who would ultimately benefit from a change in the capitalist mode of production were us, the proletariat, since we are held back from realizing our true potential as humans. And so for us, true liberation and freedom requires the abolition of the conditions that make us working class, the capitalist mode of production. You see, the collapse of the mode of production and the creation of a new one isn't ideological. Marx is not taking an idea and applying it to reality. He's taking reality for what it is, analysing it, creating a methodology for understanding it and drawing conclusions. For Marx, it was not necessarily communism that was inevitable, but the collapse of capitalism that was inevitable. And that's precisely why communists are important. As a capitalist mode of production leads to generalised crisis, as it constantly does, communists need to be ready to fight for a world where our lives are liberated from the monotony of labour and the inequalities of capitalism, and that we return to that communist social relationship, or as Marx said, the complete return of man to himself as a social being.
For some reason I look like I've been punched in the eyes, but I haven't. It's just been a long weekend. Right, what is a mode of production? I've used it in other videos and it seemed to cause confusion, so I've decided to make this video to try and give a briefish explanation on what it is. So, historical materialism, I explained what that was in another video, but mode of production is a core concept of historical materialism. Mode of production is the organised system for producing things that have come into existence at different historical periods. Marx defined the mode of production as having two distinct but interrelated parts: the productive forces and the relations of production. The productive forces are made up of two different things: the means of production, or the means of labour, and labour power. Means of labour are physical objects that we use to produce life, so things like tools, raw materials, machines, infrastructure, land. Labour power is, and I'm going to quote Marx because he explains it well, those mental and physical capabilities existing in a human being which he exercises whenever he produces a useful object of any description. So basically, if you take a piece of wood and a hammer and nails and you use mental and physical energy to turn that wood using those tools into something useful, that's labour power. The relations of production refer to all of the social relationships that come into existence as a consequence in the change of the productive forces, and that are independent of human consciousness. So, for example, the creation of class, the capitalist class and the proletarian class. That is the emergence of social relationships independently of human consciousness based on productive forces. So you have those people who own the means of production and those people that have to sell their labour to survive. For us proletarians, we have to sell our labour in order to survive. That process is a social relationship. These social relationships are then managed, organised, protected and justified by specific social structures that are both violent and ideological. I want to talk more about repressive and ideological state apparatuses, but I'm not going to do it in this video. So the mode of production, to recap, is the productive forces and the relations of production. On a practical level, what's important to remember is that history and the change in these modes of productions are characterised by conflict between groups of people who want to change and create new ways of doing things. That conflict doesn't come about because communists will it into existence. It comes about because of the inherent contradictions in the modes of production. Marx said, the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle, and it's no different for us living through capitalism. Communism isn't describing an idea, it's describing a social relationship, and one that can't be avoided. So, thanks for playing. Communists often use the term historical materialism and dialectical materialism, but what are they, and importantly, what are they not? Historical materialism is Marx's science of history, in which the historical process is understood as being driven by class struggle. The foundational basis of this science is that human beings first of all produce their lives. In other words, the fundamental reality of human existence is first and foremost human beings producing their existence. That is the starting point of reality. Marx then observes that in the course of humans producing life, two interdependent phenomena emerge that govern this: the forces of production and the relations of production. The forces of production are the means, tools, materials and labour that human beings have at their disposal at any given time and become organised and used to produce existence. These forces of production change and develop as humans learn and understand new things, but the way these forces of production are organised into various social relationships is what the relations of production are. Marx then observes that there's a contradiction within the relationship between these two things, the forces of production and the relations of production, where on the one hand a group benefits from the development of the forces of production, and on the other hand for another group the relations of production pose a barrier to the benefits of that development. It's here that the most important observation is made by Marx. Here he sees that this contradiction, inherent in the interplay between the relations of production and the forces of production, lies the possibility to lead to historic social transformation, where relations of production are forced to change or are abolished entirely and the previous conditions of existence are negated. The forces of production are then reorganised and new relations of production emerge. If we take the capitalist mode of production as an example, we can see that the forces of production are the factories, trains, human labour, automated machines, power plants and so on, which have come to be organised by relations of production such as private property, class, value, the division of labour, commodity exchange, money and enterprise. But the existence of these social relationships, in particular the existence of the owners of the means of production and the owners of labour power, causes tension as one resolves to maintain the relations of production in which the forces of production are controlled by them, and the other seeks to change the relations of production since they are unable to use the forces of production to their full benefit. Most of the time, this contradiction, this tension and class struggle is maintained by a precarious homeostasis within the construct of the capitalist relations of production. Although disputes and struggles happen all the time with various degrees of social upheaval, they are always resolved in a way that maintains a capitalist mode of production, almost always. What historical materialism shows us, however, is that if a class intervenes into class struggle in such a way that it aims to resolve this contradiction by seizing control of the forces of production, negating the existing relations of production and reorganising them in a way that benefits them, social transformation occurs and is possible. Now, dialectical materialism is simply the theoretical framework by which Marx and Engels understood this process of contradictions, negations, and social changes in history. By taking Hegel's dialectic and using it to observe the material world, Marx and Engels could articulate how history changes the way it does through that process of contradiction and negation. Now, you may come across some Marxists who tell you that dialectical materialism is a scientific method. This is a category error. It's like saying logic is a scientific method or ethics is a scientific method. It doesn't make any sense. Dialectical materialism is the philosophical concept that, when applied to history, provides the theoretical framework by which we understand the complex interplays at work in any given society and its development. A more pernicious application of dialectical materialism is put forward by some other Marxists, particularly Dengists, who use dialectical materialism to deform Marxist science of history, to claim that because of the nature of the general historical development of modes of production historically, capitalist relations of production cannot be immediately abolished, but must be developed into socialist relations of production over time, so that the socialist mode of production can eventually come to supersede the capitalist mode of production. This view confuses the object of negation, views class struggle as an incidental part of the process of history rather than the process of history itself, and replaces it with an economic determinist concept of historical development, and in so doing upholds social democratic nation building and the repression of proletarian resistance to the relations of production as socialist construction. If you want to learn more about historical and dialectical materialism, or you want to hear it from the horse's mouth, then try reading Marx's book The German Ideology and Engels' book Anti-Dühring. Both can be found on the Marxist Internet Archive.
Capitalism is simply not the dominant mode of production in China.
A mode of production is defined by its relations of production. Unique to the capitalist mode of production are generalized commodity production and exchange, value as a social construct, abstract labor, and the domination of the labor process by capital through which value becomes more value. Those relations of production that I've just described, as well as private ownership of the means of production and wage labor, all prevail in China as they do around the world. Now, that's not a moral or a political judgment. It is a precise accounting of the objective economic characteristics that make the capitalist mode of production definable. If they're not what define the capitalist mode of production, what are? Now, if you want to learn more about what I'm talking about, then I recommend reading Capital by Karl Marx. If you're not interested in doing that, fine. But why not just be honest and acknowledge that what you're actually advocating for is social democratic nation ruling and not communism. Stalinists and Dengists are nothing but glorified social democrats, and often call those who reject their productivist conception of history idealists and anti-dialectical, particularly those who, like Marx, understand the historical necessity for the immediate abolition of capitalist relations of production. The reason for this is because they fundamentally misunderstand Marx's science of history, and I'm going to explain why. Because of capitalism's historical tendency to centralise and socialise the forces of production, Stalinists and Dengists rightly acknowledge that this will eventually come into conflict with the reproduction of capitalist relations of production. But they incorrectly see this contradiction between socialised production and private appropriation of the social product as in and of itself leading to the creation of socialism. For the Stalinists and Dengists, the function of class struggle is to politically dispossess the capitalists, take control of the economy, and intensify that contradiction, developing the socialisation and centralisation of the productive forces, eventually causing ever-increasing monopolisation in which the social product becomes more and more socially owned and the gradual disappearance of private ownership occurs. Private property then becomes controlled by the state rather than private individuals. Abstract labour is still the measure of value, and the appropriation of surplus value continues, but its social function has changed as the economy is now directed by a socialist state. This is the basis of their political defence of actually existing socialism. Now, the purpose of this video is not to contest whether those countries are socialist. By the definition and standards of those calling it socialism, it is socialism. Whether that's true or not is of no importance. Likewise, I'm not attempting to make any normative judgment about past revolutions. The question of whether things could or should have been done different is of no interest to me. What's important is the fundamental misreading of Marx's discoveries and the essential rejection of his science of history. Putting aside the fact that for Marx the category of socialism was not different to the category communism, the Stalinist-Dengist era occurs because of their decentering or reducing the status of class struggle in Marx's conception of history, as well as the reification of contradiction and either failing to consider or ignoring the historical specificity of certain social relations under capitalism. Marx discovered that social relations of production emerge independently of human will as a consequence of humans producing the world around them. This is the fundamental basis of Marx's materialist conception of history. Human beings, in the first instance, take up the activity of producing their existence, and it's from this activity that social relations emerge, not the other way around. Under capitalism, the historically specific process of capitalism's subsumption of the labour process allowed social relations like generalised commodity production and abstract labour as value to emerge as specific capitalist relations of production. So in other words, the expansion of capital, which is the human activity of valorising value, produced historically unique ways of organising and categorising that human activity. In the feudal mode of production, serfs and peasants by and large directly produced and consumed the products of their labour only after the owner of the land had taken their portion. This relation of production, called serfdom, was enforced and reproduced through direct violence and dispossession. If you didn't rent a piece of land and directly produce the things you needed, you would likely not survive well. Because of technological advancement, the emergence of handcraft industries and exploration, different forms of human activity emerged. This allowed the accumulation of wealth and the emergence of a new class of people. The development of this new activity then created or exacerbated a contradiction, because the activity of accumulating wealth became inhibited by the feudal social relation that prevailed. In feudal relations of production, the peasants were tied to the nobility, and therefore the transformation of those peasants into workers whose labour could be exploited to produce more wealth was being prevented. Under the conditions of their existence, this merchant class could not take labour and the means of production and unify them to valorise value, to expand capital, because the lords and kings owned the peasants. The social relations of production that prevailed under feudalism directly stopped this emerging bourgeoisie from achieving that advancement, and so through various struggle and revolutions they intervened into their class struggle. Eventually their struggles and revolutions were successful only when they were able to abolish serfdom and allow capital to subsume the activity of the peasants and transform them into wage labourers, producing new capitalist relations of production. This historical process was not the conscious will of the bourgeoisie, nor was it the direct result of some metaphysical process led by contradiction. It was the historically contingent result of one class in struggle with another, successfully intervening to abolish the conditions of its dispossession, resulting in the transformation of human activity, which then produced the emergence of new social relations. If you took the Dengist and Stalinist conception of history, the bourgeois class would have seen their class struggle as purely political, with the labour of peasants and their means of labour simply needing to be reproduced in the service of private individuals rather than the nobility, and a general development of those productive forces, an intensification of the contradiction, and eventually an emergence of generalised commodity production and abstract labour as value would take place. They would not have immediately abolished the feudal relations of production, simply dispossessed the king of his political power and changed the social function of the prevailing historically specific relations of production. But this is obviously not what happened. If social relations of production are to become communist, the proletariat must take control of the productive forces, which is labouring and means of labour, and immediately stop the activity that makes them proletariat, because it is only in ceasing to produce the world as a class belonging to capital and take up the activity of producing the world directly for their need that new communist relations of production can be produced. Generalised commodity production and abstract labour as value are historically specific, specific. If you take control of the productive forces but reproduce the activity that caused those historically specific relations of production to emerge, you cannot then produce new social relations of production. If you engage in the activity of producing and exchanging commodities and measuring a portion of labour as value, commodity production and exchange and value cannot be abolished. You also cannot impose relations of production onto historically specific activity. You can impose an ideological categorization of them. You can call it socialist commodity production, socialist wage labour, socialist surplus value, just as the capitalists could have called it capitalist serfdom or capitalist tithing. But simply applying this ideological categorization doesn't qualitatively transform the fundamental material reproduction of that human activity. It simply changes what it's called. In other words, if the activity of the class does not fundamentally change, even if its social function is different, then the historically specific relations of production that direct and organise that activity are going to be reproduced. Contradiction cannot impose decisions onto history. Contradictions do not have the power to end forms of human activity. Contradiction doesn't have the material capability to determine historical outcomes. Contradiction doesn't have a brain, it doesn't have muscles or nerves or organs. It cannot decide how history will be shaped. Yes, class struggle is a result of contradiction, but it is only the activity of historically determined classes in struggle that can move history forward, not the contradiction itself. Class struggle is therefore not simply a political operation, and historically specific relations of production are not ideological social categories, but the result of specific human activity. In the first instance, it is the contingent action of class struggle that makes the transformation of the mode of production possible. For Marx, the importance of class struggle is not to simply politically dispossess the bourgeoisie, but the historical operation of negating forms of human activity by other forms of human activity from which communist social relations can emerge. Now, I know what the response to this will be. Marx lived 200 years ago. Others have had to adapt his theories to the reality of modern society. But historical materialism isn't a theory. It's not a belief that he's imposing on reality. It's not a decision Marx has made. It's the observable, verifiable material reality of history. The historical transformation of modes of production isn't a political decision. It's not a thought experiment. It's the fundamental basis of understanding how material history unfolds. That's not to say that revolutions are inevitable, they aren't. It's not to say that communist social relations are inevitable, they aren't. It's to understand the centrality of class struggle and its content as the deciding factor in whether human activity can be liberated. In the German ideology, Marx explains, the first premise of all human history is the existence of living human individuals. The first historical act is the production of the means to satisfy their needs, the production of material life itself. Thus, the first fact to be established is the physical organisation of these individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature. Under capitalism, this relationship is mediated by value and its valorization. People cannot access means of consumption directly, but only through wage labour and commodity exchange. The social need under capitalism to valorize value degrades and divides productive activity. It disconnects us from the land and from the tools to exploit it directly for our own benefit. It transforms us into wage labourers and binds us to a social relationship whereby the things we produce are not used by us immediately but are taken away and sold back to us. This insane formation of social relations has prohibited the physical organisation of the proletariat in their own interest and has determined our relation to each other and to nature as one of separation. The only way to end that separation is through proletarian revolution. Revolutions arise through an escalation of class struggle, and class struggle is the driving force of history, whereby a class confronts the contradictions of a given mode of production. In capitalism, this struggle emerges from the tension between capital's self-valorization and the proletariat's need to sustain their lives. These two things are mutually exclusive, and therefore conflict arises. These struggles are not merely a political expression of discontent, but are an intrinsic, immanent dynamic of history. History, as Marx explained, is nothing but the continuous activity of humans producing material life and arising from that the reproduction of social relations that govern it. In order to transform those social relations, we must change the productive activity that produces material life. It is only through new forms of productive activity that new kinds of social relations can emerge. That activity must, therefore, take on a determinate content. The activity of actually ceasing to reproduce ourselves in one way and actually beginning the activity of reproducing ourselves in a different way. This means the content of the revolution must be the activity that produces communist social relations. Communist social relations come about only through taking up the activity of producing our material life for need. They can only be produced by the proletarian class directly organising production and distribution based on need. Organising our productive activity for need thereby dismantles commodity exchange, wage labour and the division of labour, and begins to end all other mediating activity that separates humans from their means of subsistence, from each other and from nature. By accomplishing this, we have abolished ourselves as a class and produced communism. Class struggle is not a tool to be instrumentalised so that political power over pre-existing forms of productive activity and social relations can be captured. It is not a tool to be instrumentalised in order to simply reorganise the distribution of resources. Class struggle, being the intrinsic dynamic of history, will exist wherever the social relationship of value prevails and human need is not primary. It is only through classes in struggle that our productive activity can be transformed, and only if the content of that class struggle is the actual physical communist reorganisation of material life. The development of productive forces, technological advancements, automation, political domination of the state, economic prosperity, the reorganisation of resource distribution, centralisation of the means of production and their socialisation cannot determine communist social relations. They do not have the power to transform the kind of human activity that reproduces the way we relate to each other and to nature independently of class intervention. Only the proletariat in struggle, physically, objectively, actually changing their productive activity as the revolution itself can accomplish this. If the revolution becomes nothing more than the productive activity that reproduces the social relations that determine us as a class, namely commodity production and exchange, wage, labour, value and money, then the class is reaffirmed and the revolution is defeated. German ideology by Karl Marx has come under renewed scrutiny given the ongoing publication of the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, which is the new official authoritative publication of Marx and Engels' complete works. This huge project, led by international Marxologists and academics, has revealed many interesting things about the pair's works, which have challenged traditional Marxist assumptions. Amongst them is the revelation regarding the history of the German ideology, of which the editors of Mega say this: an integral or even just a fragmentary work called The German Ideology from the pen of Marx and Engels does not exist. But many people reading the German ideology for the first time will be forgiven for thinking it presents itself as a complete book. You will come across notes of incompleteness, some passages even end mid-sentence, yet the way it's structured and its authorship seem fairly straightforward. This is a coherent book written by Marx and Engels. In reality, however, the German ideology is actually just a collection of disjointed notes and fragments of manuscripts written not just by Marx and Engels but by others too. It was originally intended to be a series of polemical articles against the young Hegelians and Max Stirner for publication in a political journal. The chapter of the text that has come to be called Theses on Feuerbach was never intended for publication and was in fact just preparatory notes by Marx for these intended articles. When the group was unable to gather any interest in its publication, either as articles or as a larger work, the project was abandoned and neither Marx nor Engels returned to it. Engels eventually published the notes on Feuerbach as an appendix to an 1888 work of his own. The German ideology as we have it today was the editorial project of Soviet Marxists in the Marx-Engels Institute in the USSR in the 1930s. The titles, order and structure of the text do not come from Marx or Engels, but are the editorial choices of David Ryzanov, a Soviet scholar in the institute who was eventually persecuted and murdered by Stalin in 1938. With the publication of the original unedited notes, without the retrospective editorial interventions that shaped Ryzanov's text, the traditional notion that the German ideology presents a coherent, programmatic statement of historical materialism has been brought into question. Some contemporary writers, particularly Sarah Johnson, who wrote an article called Farewell to the German Ideology, suggest that these new discoveries should lead to a shift away from treating the German ideology as some kind of foundational statement of Marxism and historical materialism, and instead recognising it as a part of Marx's evolving critique, which was later superseded by more mature works. I think there's some merit to this view. For the German ideology to be a complete and coherent exposition of historical materialism, Marx and Engels would need to have already worked out and finalised its core principles in a structured, programmatic way, and this is obviously not the case. We cannot call a collection of notes and half-written manuscripts a complete work. That would just be ridiculous. But that doesn't alter the fact that Marx did write what has become known as Theses on Feuerbach, and I contend that the order of these notes does not take away from their purpose, their argument and their conclusions. What's more, his materialist conception of history and understanding of class consciousness was not just some theoretical project he abandoned along with the notes, but is present in both earlier and later works. Indeed, in my view, it's the foundation upon which he builds his entire critique of political economy. Yes, the history of the German ideology is complicated, and no, it's not a work of systemization and it shouldn't be treated as such. But key parts of it are authored by Karl Marx, and it does outline an understanding of reality that is present throughout Marx's whole body of work. The German ideology, in whatever form it comes, is an important, meaningful and essential text for understanding Marx's entire critique.